Well, hello everyone. I just wanted to show off the latest model that I pretty much completed here on my workbench and give a little history about the plane and kind of a little World War II history. So this is story time with Dr. Knapp. The plane here in front of you is the F4F-4 Wildcat. It's pretty much the plane that carried the weight for the U.S. Navy in the years 1942 and most of 1943. It entered service right in the late 1939 into 1940 after the Navy had issued a request for competition for a new monoplane fighter. Up to that time, the fighters were biplanes, and the successor, or the plane right before this, was the F4F built by Grumman, which looked a lot like this in the body, but was a biplane. The two competitors were the Brewster Buffalo, which I have a model up on my ceiling. I'll show you that maybe here in a minute, and the Wildcat. The original Wildcat had fixed wings with 450 caliber machine guns with 2 in each wing. The Wildcat had some issues during the competition, and Brewster Buffalo won the competition and was the first monoplane fighter that was put on the aircraft carriers. What they soon found out, though, was that the Brewster Buffalo, the landing gear was weak and had a lot of landing accidents and collapses, and that added weight to the original plane was underpowered, and it just wasn't very good. So by the time World War II started, the Brewster Buffalo fighter planes have been mainly pushed from the Navy into the Marine Corps, which happened a lot. And the only time that they were actually really used in combat for the U.S. was at the Battle of Midway, and just about every one of them was shot down during the opening minutes of the battle, flying off the island of Midway. So the F4F-4 hit the market right as the war was starting. It had folding wings from Grumman that folded up like a paper clip, and it came out with 6 50 caliber machine guns. The problem that they found with that was that the 4 50 caliber machine guns had about 1,200 rounds per gun, and when they added the 2 extra machine guns, they cut the rounds almost in half, so they had more guns, but they couldn't fire as long. But this was the plane that in the Pacific accounted for the first of the air aces for the United States. Most of them come from the Navy and the Marine Corps. From the Marine Corps, you had guys like Joe Foss on Guadalcanal, names like Sweat and Gaylor. And for the Navy, if you ever flown into Chicago's O'Hare Field, it was named after Butch O'Hare, who was one of the first Medal of Honor winners after shooting down 5 Japanese bombers protecting the USS Lexington. The markings on this plane, and it's designed for flying off of the USS Ranger. And if you're a World War II history buff, you don't hear much about the USS Ranger. And that's because of an interesting story, is that 99.9% of the carrier action that you hear about in the Pacific is in the Pacific. You don't hear about the Atlantic, but there were aircraft carriers operating in the Atlantic. And the USS Ranger was the first aircraft carrier designed from the keel up to be an aircraft carrier. It was CV-4, it was a hull number 4. And the markings on the plane, the 4-1-F-8 4 is the carrier, the carrier air group, 1 F meaning fighter, and 8 is the 8th plane. What you don't know is the Ranger spent all of its time in the Atlantic. It was slow. It was a small, they carried a lot of planes, but it was small and slow, kind of like what the escort carriers role filled later on in the war. So they spent a lot of time ferrying P-40s from the United States over to Africa and assisting in the landings in Operation Torch in North Africa, and venturing up into the North Atlantic, searching for Japanese submarines and providing carrier air patrols over the convoys which were important. the red dots in the stars was typical of planes, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific, up till about May of 1942. And in the Pacific, what they found after the Battle of the Coral Sea was that the gunners on U.S. carriers were shooting at anything that was red because of the red ball in the Japanese airplanes. So the Navy made the decision to get rid of all the red by painting over the red dots and the red and white stripes on the tail. So, like I said, this plane carried the mail for the U.S. Navy throughout most of 1942 and all of 1942 and most of 1943, when the successor, the Grumman F4F Hellcat, hit the market and began to fill the flight decks of the fleet carriers. The Navy said that the Wildcat was a good plane. It was small, it was maneuverable, it was very fit to fly off the small flight decks of the escort carriers, which were used for escorting slow-moving convoys and for anti-submarine patrols. And they also were used to support amphibious landings in the Pacific and also in the Atlantic. But this plane, once the production of the F4F started, Grumman pushed the production of the planes to General Motors in their Eastern Aircraft Division. Under the F4F-4 became the FM-1, and then they added a little bit more powerful engine and raised the tail a little bit to deal with the torque from the engine, and became the FM-2, and that was the one that was produced all the way to the end of the war. So this is the plane. It's very interesting. It was rugged. They would tell the pilots in the Pacifics is do not get in a turning dogfight with the Japanese Zero because you are not going to come out on top. But through some experience, through Lieutenant Commander Thatch, who developed the Thatch Weave, which is basically two planes flying in tandem, weaving and protecting each other's tails, they became a pretty effective tool in the fight against the Japanese. But this was a unique one, as it spent its time hunting Germans in the Atlantic. And most people don't know that the Wildcat actually had dogfights with Axis fighter planes in the Atlantic, and that's pretty much unknown in most history stories. But there you go. That's the short 7.5 minute history of the F4F Wildcat. If you look very closely up here on the ceiling, you've got the Brewster Buffalo, which the Wildcat replaced, and you've got the F4F Hellcat right there, which replaced the Wildcat. Next up on Dr. Knapp's workbench will be an F4U Corsair. So we'll see you later.